Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And in today's video, I'd like to talk about clickbait and the internet as a medium of communication. So, right off the bat, let me just say that by clickbait, I don't just mean attractive thumbnails. I'm speaking more of the kind of false advertising or setting up false expectations kind of clickbait. So, I want to say a few things about clickbait and just how the internet is used, especially for Catholics who are communicating the faith to people through the internet or teaching or sharing what they've been learning by the medium through the medium of videos or audio podcasts or websites and blog posts, all these kinds of things. How do we communicate on the internet and how do we not communicate on the internet? And these are things I've been thinking about, and I think that they're important to consider, especially if you're Catholic or Christian in general. And maybe there's a few things that we have not considered that we need to. So, the first thing I want to say is that this bad kind of clickbait that I think should be avoided is one that uh, can express itself in various ways. One way that we've all encountered is setting up a thumbnail with outright lies, right? So, for example, a thumbnail that says, Richard Dawkins admits God exists, right? And then you watch the video and you realize that's not really what he said. That's not really what he meant. That was just for me to click on the video. So that would be, quite frankly, simply a lie, right? And so it seems to me that any clickbait, any thumbnail, or any title or art that is used by Catholics online, if your clickbait introduction is a lie, you should not use that, right? That seems pretty straightforward to me. Another example might be, right, coming from, let's say, another Christian, right? Catholic admits works-based salvation. Now, the unfortunate fact of the matter is that maybe the Catholic in the video does, which would be very unfortunate. But usually, if you listen, that's not what the Catholic said, right? And so again, we don't open up by saying something false in order to grab attention and then get people sucked into the video. But of course, I could come up with all kinds of examples, right? Catholics saying things, Protestants saying things, or what have you. So, atheists too. But right now, I guess I would hold Christians and especially Catholics to a higher standard, which is that when you're making um, videos, audio, podcasts, and writing blog posts, if the way you grab people's attention is by lying, I feel like that's immoral. That should be pretty, obvious to at least it is to me. Another way in which clickbait sometimes happens is by subtle lies, right? So maybe, for example, so and so destroys so and so, right? Uh, is it true that the person in the video wins an argument? Maybe so, right? In fact, sometimes maybe not, even though the person who uploaded the video thinks so, right? But regardless, does that person destroy the other person? Maybe it's possible that intellectually speaking, there's an argument where a destruction takes place. That's possible. But most of the time, that's not the case. So is it true? Is it not true? It seems to me it's basically a subtle lie, a kind of smaller, more sneaky lie, right? And it seems to me that if we're sharing things and communicating through the internet, right, we shouldn't have attention grabbers that are filled with subtle lies, right? And then another way that clickbait, I think, is used is in a way to make people feel like they're uninformed unless they view the content, right? It feels like I'm being blackmailed into clicking on the video, right? Now, we shouldn't put other people in the situation where we actually have to make them feel bad about themselves in order for them to provide us with the clicks that we need. You see, I think that also would be something problematic that we should not engage in. That's just, me thinking it through. If you're not lying, fine. But if you're creating, this is kind of what we see in false advertisement, right? If you're creating a sense in the viewer that there's something wrong with them unless they give you the click, that seems to me to be immoral, right? So what clickbait does, right, is that first of all, because it's so effective, it filters your information intake, right? And it, instead of you using the internet to learn about things, suddenly the internet is using you and you don't even realize it. And you're not just learning about things, that's part of it, but you're also being cut off from deeper sources of knowledge. And in fact, right, you're regressing in your development, right, intellectually, or when it just comes to being aware of things. And of course, we all know about the algorithm and then the kind of silos that the internet creates. So again, this is something that clickbait does, because only that which is effective is going to be that which is found, and then that's going to create a silo in which people are then kind of triaged, right? And so that's something that we need to be aware of. And so another thing that clickbait can do is that it feeds a kind of addiction for information, right, through dopamine hits, right? And it makes it so that people see information merely as an accumulation of data, right? And it kind of cuts them off from their body, cuts them off from reality, and therefore cuts them off from wisdom. And then what happens is that they accumulate all this information and they construct mental systems with that information, and then kind of lose touch with a kind of wisdom that comes from relationships and reality. So this is, first of all, the bad ways in which clickbait expresses itself: outright lies, subtle lies, or making you feel bad unless you click. And then, of course, it filters information intake, and then it creates silos, and it feeds a kind of dopamine addiction. I mean, to me, that sounds like something I want to stay away from, right? I want to be free from other things controlling me. I want to be in control of the tools I use, right? Uh, so, excuse me. So ultimately, that's the main thing that I think is very problematic about clickbait, right? Understood in this way. And if you're a Christian, but especially, because I'm a Catholic and I talk to a lot of Catholics, if you're a Catholic and you're using clickbait, you should really, first of all, look at whether it fits the definition or not, right? Because if it's just an attractive thumbnail, great, right? But if you're making people feel that there's something wrong with them unless they click, I don't know. You should think about that, right? And if you're lying, well, that's just wrong, right? So that's something I think is important that we start to keep in mind more as Christians, as Catholics, when we're communicating with the internet. Now, on the other side of clickbait, this is something that I think is positive that we want to use as Christians and as Catholics, and that is beauty, right? Of course, Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Ministries is a perfect example of a whole slew of videos, audio content, courses, articles, and all sorts of different ways of communicating through the internet, and never will you find anything that fits the definition of clickbait. And yet look um, at how successful and effective the communication of Word on Fire is. This, it seems to me, is a perfect example of how Christians, and especially Catholics, ought to use the internet. So beauty, it grabs your attention not through lies, not through making you feel bad so you click, but through wonder, through truth and goodness, because beauty is one of the three transcendentals of being. You can't separate beauty from truth, and beauty from goodness, and goodness from truth. All three of them come together. And so you're not lying, right? And you're not making people feel bad so that they do something to make you benefit. Beauty creates a sense of wonder, of expansiveness, and it actually evangelizes. It makes people hear and listen and be sensitive to the truth and to what is really good in itself, right? And so beauty speaks to you, right? And it gives you a spiritual sense of God, who is beauty itself, and of mystery, right? And you're going to tell me, well, that's not as effective as thumbnails. Again, I would say Word on Fire proves that wrong. Now, we're not all Word on Fire. Fine. But there's other things out there like Ascension Press. As far as I can tell, there's no clickbait in Ascension Press, videos or podcasts. I mean, there's the St. Paul Center, right? There's no clickbait there, right? All of these different ministries, you might say, don't use clickbait, but they sure do use beauty, right? In fact, they don't just use it, but they offer it, show it, communicate it. And that's the idea here, right? All this talk of use and gain and money and profit and manipulation and making content creation, right? All this stuff we have to, we don't stop and think about it, right? So we're not using content creation to amass an audience to get product and revenue through clicks that gives us all these different things, right? No, we're communicating through a medium that we're using and it's not using us, right? And it's the power of beauty, truth, and goodness that will be effective, not lies, subtlety, and making people feel bad unless they click, right? So that's something that I think is very important for Catholics communicating the faith or just beauty, culture, literature, poetry, art on the internet, right? So, uh, beauty speaks to you. It speaks to your spiritual sense of God and mystery. It puts you in contact with reality. Unlike false advertising, which creates a false reality that actually makes you feel dissatisfied and ungrateful until you've satisfied that itch. So, through beauty and not clickbait, we're put into contact with reality. And isn't that crazy that on the internet, which is almost like a step away from reality, right? Through clickbait and advertising, we get stuck in the silos, right? But through beauty coming out in the internet, it actually brings people back to reality. And it becomes a back and forth where the internet is now a tool that we use and not something that uses us and isolates us and takes us away from reality, right? Okay. So, of course, beauty deepens your ability to make informed judgments, right? Your sense of what's right and what's wrong, of what's good and what's true, and of what's wise and what's superficial, right? That sense is sharpened by beauty, and your spiritual sense is expanded, right? And so I think that's something that is exactly the opposite of what clickbait does and of what this kind of way of approaching the internet does. So, in other words, the online landscape is depressingly shallow, unspiritual, secular, and ultimately, my argument is right now, if you look at it, it's profoundly immoral, right? So, and I'm not propping myself up as a good example, emulate me. I think we're all in this mess together, and so we need to talk about it and try to do what's right. So, in my opinion, clickbait as I've been describing it, okay, not just attractive thumbnails, clickbait as I've been describing it is immoral for Catholics to use. Again, I mean the kind of clickbait that lies, that makes you feel bad so you click, or that subtly implies things that are not in the video, right? That to me, I think is immoral. I could be wrong, and we can talk about it and we can, further discuss this, right? I'm open to hearing from others what they think. So ultimately, I like Bishop Barron's ministry, right? I have him on the thumbnail because I want to talk about the effectiveness and the honesty, right? The moral means by which Bishop Barron communicates the faith to people through the internet, right? I mean, his ministry, Word on Fire, is the most far reaching Catholic, in fact, Christian ministry that I know of. Okay. It's the most beautiful when it comes to art, when it comes to thumbnails, when it comes to articles, when it comes to books, publishing, audio podcasts, music. It's one of the most beautiful ministries out there, right? And the content, right, is substantive. It's deep, it's spiritual, it's effective, and it's, something that makes you wonder. I mean, they have uh whole series, right? Whole playlists of topics that are titled with wonder, or creation and wonder, or science and wonder, or they have a wonder conference and all this kind of stuff. I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is great, right? And so the depth, the spirituality, the substantial um, communication, right? The wisdom, the beauty, and its far-reaching aspect. You see, this shows that we can do better, and we can do so effectively. We don't have to use things that are actually immoral, even subtly so. So, on the other hand, when you look at Christian or Catholic YouTube, you might say kind of out there in the internet stratosphere, you might say, you have some channels that are extremely shallow, very narrow minded, right? Very clicky, all these clickbait, outrage, and, you know, um, exposition of things, complaints, or just really shallow readings of documents and of scripture, of the tradition of the church, of literature. It's just very narrow minded and very outragey. And it's a lot of information dumping and almost no wisdom most of the time. Now, that's a broad brush. Some people are on a spectrum, right? And I'm not saying that, I'm not on that spectrum either, right? I'm just saying we need to talk about this. Okay. So the way I'd compare it, right, would be like the difference between fast food, right, and French cuisine, right? To be a little fancy here. The fast food, it's easy to get. It hits the dopamine. You're satisfied. You can get more, and but the consequences is isolation. Your health deteriorates, and it's just not good for you. But French cuisine can bring people together around a meal that lasts a certain amount of time, which facilitates conversation, culture, communion, and all of these enjoyment of food, and knowledge of other people, and knowledge of culture, and of certain mores and all that kind of stuff, right? That would be a good example of the difference here, right? But the problem is, when you look at the landscape, these fast food channels have thousands and thousands of subscribers, right? And then the better ones that don't use these immoral means, in the way I'm presenting this, usually don't do as well. But that doesn't mean that they can't do as well, as we see with Bishop Barron, St. Paul Center, Ascension Press, and things like that. So it is possible, and we should try to do it. We have to see, how can I make all the stuff I'm communicating more beautiful, right? So I think Word on Fire is a great example to tell us, to show us that this is possible. And that is what we should strive for, right? Not for what's easy, but for what's difficult and yet bears more fruit and better fruit, right? Deeper fruit. So finally, I would say knowledge is not a commodity. It's not something you sell and something you distribute and stuff like that. It's obviously okay if certain courses and videos you have are behind paywalls, because this is not just a means of communication, but a means of producing money to communicate more. That's okay, right? But if you reduce knowledge to a commodity, right, then you're going to lose on what knowledge actually is. So, knowledge is not a commodity, it's a dramatic encounter with reality. And that's why beauty is so important when you communicate knowledge. Another quote that, well, not a quote from John Sr., I'm going to paraphrase it, but it goes something like: education is not the accumulation of data, but the lighting of a flame, right? Knowledge, education, knowing, right? It's something that cannot be divorced from life, from living, from experience, from encounter, from drama, from literature, poetry, philosophy, theology, prayer, mysticism, spirituality, beauty, the arts, music, all this kind of stuff, right? If you all you have is this accumulation of data, that's not knowledge. It's a counterfeit, and that's dangerous. So we use these terms, right? Content creator, audience, subscriber, right? Goals, a persona, right? Channel, social media, brand, influencer, consumer, right? To consume content. Some of those words I think are okay. Others, maybe we should reconsider. So instead of content creation, I'm going to try and say communication, right? I'm not creating content that is then, distributed, bought, accumulated, what have you. I'm going to try and speak of what I'm doing as communication, right? As a dialogue, right? Having interlocutors. And that's why the word audience, I think personally, I don't like it. So I'm going to try to drop it. Doesn't mean it won't slip, but I'm going to try to drop the word audience. Now I'm just going to say interlocutors, right? So I am engaging in communication via the internet, and I have interlocutors, right? And you guys can interact with me and I can respond as best I can, right? And again, subscriber, well, I mean, it's going to be inevitable, right? That this word is going to be used. But as much as possible, I'd like to also say interlocutor, right? Invested interlocutor, right? Interested interlocutor, you know, yeah. So not just subscriber, although it's going to be hard to avoid that one, right? But audience, I think should be dropped. I mean, why would we say audience? And content creation, I really don't like that one. So these are I'm just telling you about things I'm going to try and adopt. Language I'm going to try and adopt, right? And persona, right? YouTube persona, online persona, that should just be dropped completely, right? If you are lying online, right? You have a fake persona, you should check that, right? So that's something I'm just not going to use at all. Now, channel, right? Um, it's a benign term, but I thought about this. Instead of calling my channel a channel, right? I just call it an outreach, right? My YouTube outreach. And social media, I think, is a great term. In fact, the church uses it, and it accurately describes the tool that the internet is, right? Social media. So I think that's good, right? And then the whole idea of a brand, again, it's a benign term. Personally, I think I might try and say approach, right? I have a style, an approach a style of communicating, right? An approach, a kind of pedagogy, right? That's just something I've been thinking about. And I don't like the term influencer, although it is rather benign, I think. But influencer, I don't know. It feels a little I don't know, like arrogating some authority that does not necessarily belong to people, right? So I guess I would also just say communicator, right? Communication. And finally, consumer, right? Or to consume, that one needs to be dropped. I really think we have to stick with interlocutor, or, instead of consuming, we could say engaging, right? So that's just some thoughts on the language. I mean, that's not going to happen overnight, but there are some terms like content creation and audience and consumer that I really don't like, and I'm going to do my best to avoid them and speak in terms of communication, interlocutors, and engaging, right? And reaching out to people through communication. I like that terminology better. So, in light of everything I've said, right, the thing about the internet, it seems to me, is that it promises this large scale interconnection, intercommunication, right? Internet, a web, right? It promises communion, it promises connectedness. But no one watching this is unaware of the fact that it often, if not always, yields the opposite, right? It yields isolation, right? And we see this especially in the silos that are developing since the last 20 years because of the internet. More like 15 years, but silos are kind of, developing, and isolation is increasing, right? I mean, think of kids getting sucked into video games, and I'm not bashing video games. I'm just saying this tends to become eventually a problem where people lose touch with reality, or they lose touch with the capacity to communicate with people that don't see eye to eye. And that kind of communication, usually, if it's done well, benefits both people and they expand their understanding of things, right? With the internet, that's not happening, right? And so the internet has promised us interconnectedness, and it's been yielding division and isolation. And so I've considered just up and leaving, right? But I was thinking about Plato, right? Plato was very critical of writing, right? He much preferred dialoguing, speaking, right? Interacting, lived experience. He was actually very critical of the mode of communication that developed at the time through writing, right? So what did he do? Well, he actually wrote the famous dialogues, right? The structure of the dialogues is fascinating because what it does is it sets up this conversation between, excuse me, between Socrates and an interlocutor, right? And it unfolds this communication, this dialogue, right? And it actually leads the reader beyond the page and back to reality and to thinking about what he read and thinking about being itself and then talking about the dialogue with people in real life. The way the dialogues are structured are actually meant to lead the reader outside and beyond them. That there's a kind of openness in the dialogues that's really fascinating once you see it, right? In Plato's dialogues, there's this back and forth, but it's not a rigid kind of enclosed back and forth, but something that opens up beyond the page and kind of propels you into being. It's really beautiful. And I think that behind this, we have the analogy that Plato gives us of the cave, right? In the cave, people are chained, right? People are stuck and they see shadows on the wall and they go off of what they see, the shadows, right? But not the substance of things. But the philosopher unchains himself, kind of sneaks out of the cave, climbs all the way up, and gets to the real world where he beholds the forms, right? And is enlightened. Christianity will pick this up with baptism and the sacraments, but that's for another time. The philosopher is enlightened. And then once he comes to see, to encounter, to experience the good in itself through dialogos, right? Through the ascent, right? Then he comes back down and then he tries to tell people what he's discovered, hopefully, in order to bring them with him also to true wisdom. But of course, the result is they crucify him, right? Well, in the Republic, Plato speaks of it as impaling, right? The just man is impaled, right? And that's because the internet is a dark place. I think it's a bit of a cave, okay? But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't go in and try to get people to see. But here's the cool thing about adding to this Platonic analogy, the Christian one, because it's precisely in the impaling of Christ that the true liberation from the cave takes place, right? So on Holy Saturday, Christ descends into the ultimate place of isolation, the ultimate place of non-communication, right? And by being communion with the Father himself, right? By being life, light from light, true God from true God, right? He undoes isolation, right? And brings all those isolated in Hades up with him, through, his body back into communion with him, into a higher life. And so the Christian leading with beauty ought to enter the place of isolation, it seems to me, and remind people of what's immoral, what's moral, what's right and just, right? And to show beauty and explain truth, and always in a humble way, right? Truth is something larger than us, but that is, in a certain sense, all around us. And to engage in dialogue with the culture through the medium of this communication called the internet, and thereby bring people back to true wisdom. And in the process, it might lead to persecution, right? But in the love that the Christian, um, in a certain sense, expresses, even under persecution, maybe just that way he might win more people to true wisdom, which is a humility that is expressed in love, right? So that's why I think it's good for Catholics, for Christians, to be using this medium, but don't fall for the immoral means. Try to, fix anything that you think is, not honest in your thumbnails and stuff like that. Just some thoughts. um I really want to give a shout out to Kyle Whittington and Drew the Catholic. Um, I love what they're doing, right? Kyle started this conference, this Catholic Creator Conference, where a bunch of people making videos got together and met in real life. That, I think, is something that is exactly the kind of thing we should be doing. And Drew, of course, thinks a lot about the internet and its effect on us and its effect on religion in general, right? And so I'm just really glad there's people thinking about this. Um, So that's all I got today, but I want to check the chat here. Oh, thanks, Eric. We got Daniel. Thanks, Daniel. Yep, I'm back. Thanks, Richard. Haley's in the chat. Yeah, it's good to see you guys. Yeah, I've been gone. In fact, I'm going to be doing a video today on the books I've read this month because I've been away from the internet. So, without further ado, I think this is a great place to end this live stream. All these terms, right? And I just want to thank everybody for engaging in this dialogue with me, even though it's a little one-sided. But you can engage in the comments, and we can continue this exploration together. So, without further ado, if you enjoy this, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and consider helping me continue my communication of the faith and of beauty with others by supporting me at patreon.com/the Logos Project. And without further ado, we'll see you all next time. God bless.